Okay, chapter 16, part 1 is the transformation of the West. Here are some learning objectives. Just make sure that once you complete chapter 16, that you're comfortable with all of these and you'd be able to answer them on an exam if I were to ask something about these. So the mythology of the West starts really with Frederick Jackson Turner's idea of the frontier thesis. He delivers a paper at the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago, which we'll talk about in the next module. But he's a historian. He views the frontier as the birthplace of American values and characteristics, and really American culture, the boundary between civilization and savagery. And it creates this kind of rugged individual that's unique to American mythology. And part of his thesis is that the frontier is now closed. And so this kind of embodiment of American individuality is now no longer there. So where are we taking our culture from, or where are we driving ourselves to next? And so really what the frontier thesis is doing is it's connecting to America's expansionism and empire that we'll be talking about in the next chapter. And we'll see that the frontier actually doesn't really go away, even though Turner is claiming that it is now gone. But it's an interesting idea to think about the mythology of what Turner is trying to say. So what helps transform the American West? We have economic transformations with homesteading, immigration, and agriculture. We have gold and silver mining, and we even have industry. And industry follows the railroad pretty much. Incidentally, these houses are mostly sod houses or log cabins. And the sod houses in the bottom right, can you imagine living in that? I wouldn't want to. Thank you. But hey, it's all you got. It's all you got, right? So this is a painting, Spirit of the Frontier, that kind of shows the kind of manifest destiny, if you will, of the American West. To the left of the picture, you have the buffalo roaming and the Indians kind of heading off to the left-hand side of the picture. In the middle, you have this woman carrying a telegraph wire and a school book, and you've got the Conestoga wagon with the settlers and miners, and and then behind her are the railroads, and then the east. So this is really kind of a summation of what happens to the American West. It becomes industrialized. So the first real homesteading in the West takes place in the Oregon Territory, and this is kind of back before the Civil War. You have the Donation Land Claim Act of 1850, and my point of putting this in here is to show you that there were homesteading efforts made prior to the Civil War. During the Civil War, we were very much embroiled in Indian wars, and we'll talk more about those. Well, what's interesting here is that you had 320 acres for a single homesteader or 640 for married homesteaders. Of course, what they're trying to do is attract families to settle in these areas. And this is a trick that the government uses in a number of different ways. They're trying to basically populate an area. And normally, they will put settlers in the path of trouble. I don't know if it's intentional, but I think it is. Where usually if it's a disputed territory or an area that is seeing a lot of Indian activity, or potentially in this case, disputed area around Canada or Britain, they're trying to get American settlers in there so that they can claim to be protecting the American settlers. In this case, we have a little bit of both, because the Indian territory, as we'll see, is very much tied to this area. But one of the interesting facts about this is that the homesteading effort here excluded African Americans in Oregon. And you'll see that listed on the slide as well. But just take a look at the slide and let me know if you have any questions about it. But this is, again, just kind of giving you an idea of what is happening before the major homesteading pushes after the Civil War. So the Homesteading Act of 1862, during the middle of the war, was coming out of the Free Soil Party of 1848 and the Republican Party of 1854. The two parties kind of join together and unite, and so homesteading becomes part of the platform of the Republican Party. They wanted the land available to independent farmers, but not to planters, planters being slave owners. So the idea of free labor, labor that is either wage labor or free in terms of self-sufficient, was the goal here. Certainly Southerners would have refused to support the law. However, of course, we're in the middle of the war, so they're not actually in Congress, so the bill passes, of course. But the process, you file the application, you improve the land. Improve means you clear for farming and you build buildings. You have to build a home, you have to build a barn. These things mean that the land is now permanently maintained, at least for the government purposes. And that's an important thing to remember. And then you file for the deed. And one of the interesting things about this particular case is that if you file for a deed, you had to apply and state in oath that you would not take arms against the United States. So, in other words, you couldn't be a Confederate sympathizer and also apply for a homestead land claim. One of the ways in which homesteaders expanded their claim was by using the Timber Culture Act of 1873. One of the big problems in the Great Plains was that there were no trees. It was mostly just grassland. And so this was a way for the government to build more forests. In other words, build building material, plant trees, let the trees mature, and then that would be a source for lumber for further building. So you could get an increase of 160 acres of land if you planted at least 40 acres of trees, which was a real small percentage compared to the big old tract that you would actually get. Okay, and there's a picture of the bottom left. These kind of groves and stuff are really largely absent from the Great Plains. It was all literally just grassland. The Kincaid Amendment in 1904, this is a way that homesteading extends into the 1900s. We tend to think of homesteading as being majorly centered around the 1860s, 1870s, and even the 1880s, and it is for the most part. But here in Nebraska, the sandhills are literally, it's inarable land that cannot grow anything or sustain anything. But here's a way that you can go in and you can get some of this land. And so who is going to be attracted to this? Mostly people who don't have a lot of money. And so you have poorer farmers or people who might be might be laborers on another farm who will apply for this. So you had to be at least 21 years old. You had to have 5 years of residency, and you had to provide improvements. Again, keep in mind what the term improvement meant, or what to improve the land. It meant that you proved residency by building a home, a barn, and what have you. Basically, this amendment, the Kincaid Amendment, was put forth by a Nebraska congressman in order to get the land into the hands of individuals. Also, if you have people on the land, then that means you can draw taxes. So this is yet another way to benefit the government, but this time the state government, is by giving them this ability to tax the people that would actually come and live there. I mean, not a lot, but it creates individuals for taxes. It also ends the fencing and land controversies over the land. So one of the things that happens, and we'll talk about this, is the fight between ranchers and farmers. Ranchers wanted free range. Farmers wanted to fence off the land, obviously, because if you've got cattle running around, they'll eat your crops, and that's not good. It also attracts a number of African Americans, and so they create a number of settlements of their own. DeWitte, Nebraska is one such town. It lasts until 1936, but you have 185 by 1920, 185 African American families there. It's pretty good. You have religious groups who take advantage of the Western expansion. The Mormons are a very good example of this. You have other organizations, but the Mormons are probably the most successful and widely known. They started off originally in upstate New York in 1830, and then by the time they get to Utah, it's 1847. So really, in the course of 17 years, they have quite a long history. If you're ever in Salt Lake City, be sure to check a park. It's outside of Salt Lake City called This Is the Place. And it's a pioneer town that shows you some of these old buildings, and they're on the left-hand side. But it commemorates the fact that Brigham Young led the Mormons through the West on the Mormon Trail and came to the valley that would ultimately become Salt Lake City. But you can see on the bottom right, the Mormon Temple, the Mormon Tabernacle is in the back, that big kind of gold-looking building. It's a neat city. I've been there and I enjoyed touring around. As I've mentioned, African Americans play a big role in Western expansion, and the Exoduster movement is one of the kind of premier African American migration patterns. Not as big as the Great Migration that we'll talk about in the 1920s, but it's pretty significant. Again, African Americans are moving around after the Civil War. Many of them migrate from the South to places like Kansas, Oklahoma, and Colorado. And you have African Americans who are selling the land or trying to develop the land, and so they're sending these flyers like the one on the right to black churches and black communities in the South, encouraging African Americans to get out of the South. And we'll talk more about why that would be. But certainly, as we've seen in Reconstruction, this is a period when African Americans don't have a lot to lose in terms of getting out of the South. But you have towns like Nicodemus, Kansas that are formed that are strictly African American cities. And this is something that's rare at this point in time, but will become more of a kind of a regular thing, are communities that are strictly African American in nature. And it's obviously to escape a lot of the violence going on in the South, but also during Jim Crow, the laws that are enacted that are taking rights away from African Americans. We have an agricultural revolution before we have the Industrial Revolution. And this takes place prior to the Civil War. You have the use of mechanized agriculture. One of the things that takes place is this movement of ideas around mechanized agriculture from Great Britain into the United States. A lot of the similar tools are being used. And you have people like John Deere who developed this technology that really pushes agricultural productivity. Number of farms begin to increase. In 1860, you have 2 million, and then by 1905, you have 60 million. You have a lot of people who are living on farms. In 1860, you have 10 million to 22 million in 1880, and then by 1905, you have 31 million. The value of the farm themselves goes up from 1860 at 8 billion to 30 billion in 1906. So what's all happening here is that we have more people moving to the farm, we have more farms, and we have more infrastructure, farming equipment that is pushing up the value of the farms. So by 1900, one farmer could produce as much food as 20 men in 1860, and that's a pretty significant number. So imagine all of these farmers producing that much food. So this is what we're leading up to, is it's creating a surplus agriculture. This does not mean that people from the East are moving to the farms per se from the city. What you're having is you're having a large number of agricultural immigrants. So we're talking about German, Swedish, even Irish, people who in the old country were growing crops off the land, come to the United States and they don't like the city, they head towards the farm. And they are the ones who are really driving this. So immigrant labor not only produces the Industrial Revolution, but it also produces an agricultural revolution. As I mentioned before, cattle, the cattle industry is really pushing for what they call the open range, which is the lack of fencing. But as farmers and ranchers begin to collide in using the same land, you literally have wars that break out between farmers and ranchers. Farmers want fences and ranchers don't. And this is obviously a problem. Cattle have existed in the United States since the European explorers. Cattle in Florida has been pretty widespread, and a lot of the cattle that are native to Florida are ones that came over with the Spanish. So something to kind of just keep in mind is that the end of the open range has devastating effects for ranchers. But as we'll see, they're able to maintain kind of in the Midwest an area that is largely open and allows for the cattle drives to take place. And here's the cattle drive. So you can see on the map on the left, these green lines represent the cattle drives. And they're going right through, pretty harsh land. I mean, it's not really good for growing anything. So that's one of the reasons why these trails go right through, like Oklahoma. Oklahoma is not known for its lush green landscape. But you have a symbiotic relationship that develops between the railroad and the cattle industry. And this, of course, is going to make Chicago the home of the Union stockyards for that very reason, because these railroads that the cattle drivers are using connect and come into Chicago. Mining, of course, we all have heard about the 49ers, the gold rush of 1848. What's interesting is when the first to really hear about it are people who are along the West Coast, people in Oregon, but then you start seeing Latin American immigrants coming in, people from Hawaii, and then you start picking up people from the East. And so you have places just literally blow up in terms of population. So San Francisco, for example, 1846 had 200 residents. By 1852, it has 36,000. And think about the infrastructure dilemma that creates. They don't have roads, they don't have sanitary conditions, they don't have buildings to support all of these people. So literally buildings go up overnight, people are living in tents or whatever shelters they can, because the idea is that, once they find their gold, nothing is going to, it doesn't matter. They can just build their own mansion and not worry about it. At first, land remained unclaimed, and so, your claim was as good as long as you worked it. And then you start having people claim jumping, where one person would try a certain area and then they would leave, and then somebody jumps in behind them and finds something. That's claim jumping is basically, taking somebody else's abandoned claim. And, in a legal situation, you have people who literally are fighting over this issue because, who's to say that I didn't just, walk away for, I don't know, a day or whatever, and come back, and you jumped on my claim. Um, Women served a number of different roles, including entrepreneurs. Many women ran general stores because the men would be out mining. Women also were prostitutes. When you're talking about this many people moving into a city or town, and literally towns are being created overnight, it was very common for women to either be left there by maybe a dead husband who passed away, or somebody husband ran off, and so they're kind of trying to figure out how to make a living, and unfortunately sometimes that's the only way they can do it. So the Comstock lode is kind of the gold rush of the silver industry. It's discovered the first discovery of silver is in 1859. You have brothers who die and leave Comstock to ownership of the lode, but you have a number of people who become very wealthy out of the silver industry. Again, it's not reserved to just gold, it's silver as well, and other minerals. So I mentioned railroads become important for the cattle industry. It also becomes important for all types of industry. If you're thinking about mining, how are you going to get the gold and silver to the market? You have to rely upon the railroad. You can try to use a wagon, but it's considered very, very dangerous, especially within Indian Territory. So the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad between 1863 to 1869 is very important because it links the West Coast really with the East. It runs for almost about 2,000 miles. And there are three major companies that are part of the partnership that builds this railroad. The picture on the left is Promontory Point in Utah, where the Golden Spike is that unites the East and the West Railroad together. And really, as we see in the map on the left, by 1880, you have railroads really all over the West. Keep in mind, too, that in the South, the railroads were destroyed by the war. So what you're seeing in 1880 is the culmination of railroad investment in the South as well. You can see by Florida, Florida had just a few railroads, and really and truly it's going to get even more that way after 1880. But the construction of the railroads, as according to this figure on the right, you can see that during the 1880s there's a huge amount of railroad building going on. Labor in the West, you have labor shortages because you have so much being built up that it's hard for them to be able to fill all the jobs that they have. Skilled labor is largely made up of whites, but then unskilled labor, low-paying jobs, is filled by any number of different racial groups: Chinese, Filipino, Mexican, African American, and Indian. Mining, of course, is probably the riskiest of the jobs, and 1 in 30 were disabled in the 1870s, 1 in 80 were killed. So again, these are risky jobs, but they're jobs nonetheless, and if you are unemployed, then the West was the place to go. In the West, you also have a large number of Chinese that come to the United States. The coolie trade is really anybody from India or South China. It's a British practice that the United States just kind of picks up with, but it's mostly in labor-intensive industries. You don't have a lot of this in the West, cotton plantations or sugar plantations, but you do have the railroads. So the railroads are essentially run by immigrant labor, mainly the Chinese, especially in the West. Um, in 1868, Chinese immigration with the United States is unlimited, unrestricted, through a treaty that made China a favored nation with the United States in terms of trading. This will change because there are a large number of Chinese that come to the West, and native Westerners or American Westerners are not real happy about that. So a lot of the workers come to work on the railroad. In 1862, you start seeing California passing laws um, discriminating against Chinese immigrants. Um, Starts off with a tax that's imposed on them, but then um, you have any number of different laws that begin to restrict um, what Chinese laborers could do. Mostly Chinese stuck to the laundries in California. San Francisco had a number of Chinese laundries, and those were basically kind of a monopoly for them um, to operate. But Chinese would often take lower wages than white workers, and that was labor competition, and that was very seen as very unfavorable for obviously for whites. But they also were rarely assimilated into the population. They looked different. They spoke a different language. They dressed differently. They had funny food. All of these things that we normally draw. Um, differentiate ourselves from other people, um, fit in place with the Chinese, and so it was very easy for them to be picked upon by white Westerners. The Chinese use secret societies or mutual aid societies for protection and resources. So, think of it as like Chinatown. They kind of became an insular neighborhood. They protected themselves by creating neighborhoods where once they were in the confines of that neighborhood or that section of the city, they were pretty well protected from discrimination. It's only when you go outside of that that you were discriminated against. So, beginning to talk about the decline of the frontier, you have you can't not talk about this, but this is the buffalo and almost the mass extinction of the buffalo in a very relative short period of time. Um, by the 1900s, you have roughly 300 buffalo surviving. When if you look at 1830, you had about 40 million. Um, and a lot of this is because of the fur, the hide, um, the skulls. Um, but typically, white settlers did not use the entire animal. Indians and Native Americans did. Um, they considered the buffalo as kind of a sacred animal. They knew that their livelihood depended on the buffalo. They would use the meat, they would use really every part of the buffalo that they could because it was considered a sacred animal. Um, in the American West, if you were, riding out on the train and you were bored, it was not uncommon for somebody to just load a gun and lower their window of the train compartment and just start shooting at buffalo just to relieve boredom. And unfortunately, that led to a mass decline. Part of also of the decline of the frontiers are the Indian policies of the government. They had a concentration policy in place that basically gave a reservation to each tribe. And Americans still are not very good at differentiating between different Indian tribes. Um, but this was established as their policy. They would treat um, they would have specific leaders that they would work with and almost kind of work as um, as a diplomat with a foreign country in a way. And come to the 1860s, and the United States government begins to change that policy. They create the Indian Peace Commission, which had three main goals: make sure that the war does not break out, secure the frontier settlements, and the railroads, make sure that they are not stopped because of Indian uprisings, and to create some sort of plan for the quote-unquote civilization of the natives. And this is where we start running into the Carlisle Indian School, which we'll talk about in a second. So on the reservations, their goal was to have a school, was to have some sort of store where they could start assimilating the Indians into American society. The Dawes Plan in 1887 gradually eliminates tribal ownership of land and deals directly with individuals. So what the government was trying to do here is basically apply a homestead law. So you're getting 160 acres of land, 80 acres to single adults, 160 for a family, and 40 acres for dependent children. You gave them American citizenship, and you're dealing directly with the individual as opposed with the tribe. So get the tribe leadership out of the way. We're going to deal with individuals. Problem with that is that you have a loss of indigenous culture because the tribe is something that has existed prior to contact with whites. Traditions and land was lost. And of course, it's pitting natives against each other. Because now you don't have tribes to mediate between disagreements. You are dealing strictly with the individuals. The Carlisle Indian School, founded in 1879 by Richard Henry Pratt. Interesting fact, Richard Pratt was stationed at the fort in St. Augustine. I'm actually in St. Augustine, so it's here in St. Augustine. And his sister, Rebecca Pratt, began to teach the children English. And she actually taught the adults as well. But they basically focus on the Lakota tribes, especially after Custer's defeat, and try to bring the children into American society. They give them haircuts, they give them clothes to wear, they give them new names, and essentially they take the children literally by force in some cases, but they do allow the chiefs to visit. But of course, it's like a hostage situation more than anything else. So we have a number of different disagreements that pop up. These are what I call the native attempts at freedom. Little Crow and Dakota War of 1862. Chief Joseph, who is a very sad individual to read about because he really believed in his people, the Nez Perce, who lived in Washington, and he even goes to Washington, D.C. to meet with the president to try and work out a deal for his people to stay on their land. Of course, the government says no. He's just it's a very tragic story. And then, of course, you had the Battle of Little Bighorn, which was Custer's last stand, which really kind of turns the American government against any kind of native attempts at independence. The Ghost Dance movement, which was largely kind of a reinvigoration of Indian culture, it doesn't work out, obviously, but it was the idea that this was built around a prophet or seer, Indian seer's prediction that the white man would be forced out of the Indian territory, that the buffalo would return, and the Indians would be granted their control over their land again. Of course, none of those things came to fruition. And you have a tragic event that takes place on December 29th, 1890, the Wounded Knee Massacre, where you have a number of Indians who are in the cold and in their teepees, and the soldiers fire upon them And the picture on the left is one of the victims who was literally frozen to death. Well, actually, I think he was shot and killed, but then the cold kind of froze his body in place. Anyway, great book. I Buried My Heart at Wounded Knee. If you're ever interested in reading about some Indian history, that's a book that I would recommend. And this is an image of the dead Indians from Wounded Knee and the whites burying them. So as we talk about the decline of the West, or the American West as a whole, the transformation of the West, this was kind of nobody would disagree that something had to happen with the Indians. Unfortunately, many of them are moved to areas of northern Texas and Oklahoma, where, as I said, the land is not very feasible for growing crops or really making a life for yourself. But that, unfortunately, is where they wound up and where many of the reservations are. It's a tragic story, but it will, I guarantee you, tie into what we're going to be talking about in the next module.